Tebello's fingers gripped the worn wooden edges of his small fishing boat. The sea, usually so calm and giving, had turned against him. Dark clouds loomed overhead, and the waves grew taller with each passing moment. At just 19 years old, Tebello had been fishing these waters since he was a boy, but he had never seen a storm come on so quickly. I must get back, he muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the shoreline. But all around him was only angry water and menacing sky. A crack of lightning split the air, followed by a boom of thunder so loud it made Tebello's ears ring. He hunched lower in his boat, trying to make himself as small as possible. The wind howled, whipping spray into his face and soaking him to the bone. Suddenly, a massive wave rose up before him. Tebello's eyes widened in terror as he realized there was no escaping it. The wall of water crashed down upon his tiny vessel, and in an instant, everything went dark. Tebello tumbled through the water, disoriented and desperate for air. His lungs burned as he fought against the current, kicking with all his might. Just when he thought he couldn't hold his breath any longer, his head broke the surface. He gasped, sucking in great gulps of air. The storm raged on around him, but Tebello could see no sign of his boat. It had been smashed to pieces by the giant wave. He treaded water, turning in circles, searching for anything that might help him stay afloat. A piece of driftwood bobbed nearby, and he swam to it, clinging on for dear life. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Tebello drifted in and out of consciousness, the sun beating down on him mercilessly. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his throat parched from thirst. He had long since lost sight of any familiar landmarks. The young fisherman was completely lost at sea. Just when Tebello thought all hope was lost, he spotted something on the horizon. At first, he thought it might be a mirage, a trick of his exhausted mind. But as he drifted closer, he realized it was real, land. With renewed energy, Tebello kicked his legs, propelling himself and his piece of driftwood toward the shore. The closer he got, the more he could make out. It wasn't the familiar coastline of his village, but a dense, dark forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. As the waves finally pushed him onto the sandy beach, Tebello collapsed, too weak to move any further. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the ominous line of trees looming before him. When Tebello awoke, the sun was high in the sky. His whole body ached, and his skin felt tight and painful from sunburn. Slowly, he pushed himself up to a sitting position and looked around. The beach was narrow, quickly giving way to the thick forest he had seen before losing consciousness. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, their fronds offering little patches of shade. The sea stretched out endlessly behind him, calm now as if the storm had never happened. Tebello's stomach growled fiercely, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in days. His throat was so dry he could barely swallow. He knew he needed to find fresh water and food quickly if he was going to survive. With great effort, Tebello stood up. His legs shook beneath him, weak from his ordeal at sea. He took a few tentative steps toward the forest's edge, scanning the ground for any sign of fruit or coconuts that might have fallen from the trees. As he neared the tree line, a sound made him freeze. It was faint, barely audible over the gentle lapping of waves on the shore, but unmistakable. Voices, human voices. Tebello's heart leaped with hope. Perhaps there were people living on this strange shore who could help him. But something about the voices made him hesitate. They didn't sound friendly or welcoming. There was an edge to them, something almost hungry. A twig snapped somewhere in the forest, much closer than the voices had been. Tebello's instincts screamed at him to run, to hide. Without thinking, he dove into the underbrush at the forest's edge, concealing himself just as a figure emerged from between the trees. Tebello's blood ran cold. The man who stepped onto the beach was unlike anyone he had ever seen. His skin was painted with strange symbols, and bones hung from his necklace. In his hand, he carried a long, wicked-looking spear. The young fisherman held his breath, not daring to move a muscle. The stranger's eyes scanned the beach, lingering for a moment on the spot where Tebello had been lying. Then, with a grunt, he turned and disappeared back into the forest. Tebello remained hidden, his mind racing. Who were these people? What would they do if they found him? One thing was certain. He was no longer just lost. He was in danger. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the beach, Tebello knew he had a difficult choice to make. Stay hidden and hope for rescue, or venture into the unknown forest in search of food, water, and a way home. Either way, he would have to be careful. Very careful indeed. As darkness fell, Tebello's thirst and hunger became unbearable. He knew he couldn't stay on the beach any longer. With great caution, he crept into the forest, every sense on high alert. The jungle was alive with sounds: chirping insects, rustling leaves, and occasionally distant voices that made Tebello's skin crawl. He moved slowly, testing each step to avoid making noise. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, leaving him in near total darkness. After what felt like hours, Tebello heard the faint sound of running water. His parched throat ached at the thought of a drink. Following the sound, he soon came upon a small stream. Tebello fell to his knees beside it, cupping the cool water in his hands and drinking greedily. As he quenched his thirst, movement caught his eye. On a nearby tree, a cluster of large, unfamiliar fruits hung low on a branch. Tebello's stomach growled at the sight. He reached out, plucked one, and bit into it. The flesh was sweet and juicy, and he devoured it quickly, along with two more. With his immediate needs met, exhaustion washed over Tebello. He needed to rest, but the forest floor didn't seem safe. Looking up, he spotted a sturdy tree with wide branches. Using skills honed from years of climbing palm trees, Tebello ascended and wedged himself into a forked branch high above the ground. Sleep came fitfully, filled with nightmares of stormy seas and painted warriors. Tebello woke with a start just as dawn was breaking. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then reality came crashing back. As light filtered through the leaves, Tebello got his first real look at the forest. It was unlike anything he had seen before. Strange flowers bloomed everywhere, their colors vibrant and alien. Vines as thick as his arms snaked up tree trunks. In the distance, he could see the tops of mountains shrouded in mist. A rustling in the undergrowth below made Tebello freeze. He held his breath as three men emerged into view. They were dressed similarly to the one he had seen on the beach, with painted bodies and bone jewelry. Each carried a spear and a wicked-looking knife at his belt. The men moved with purpose, clearly searching for something. With a jolt of fear, Tebello realized they were probably looking for him. He had left footprints on the beach, and likely along the stream as well. One of the men stopped directly beneath Tebello's tree. He knelt down, examining something on the ground. Tebello's heart pounded so loudly he was sure they would hear it. The man called out to his companions in a language Tebello didn't understand. They gathered around, pointing and gesturing. Tebello hardly dared to breathe. One wrong move, one snapping twig, and he would be discovered. The men continued their heated discussion, occasionally glancing up into the trees. Tebello pressed himself as flat as he could against the branch, praying to every god he knew that the leaves would keep him hidden. After what seemed like an eternity, the men moved on. Tebello remained still long after their voices had faded, afraid it might be a trick. Only when the forest sounds returned to normal did he allow himself to relax slightly. Carefully, Tebello climbed down from his perch. He knew he couldn't stay in one place for long. These men were clearly skilled trackers, and it was only a matter of time before they found him if he didn't keep moving. As Tebello crept through the forest, He tried to make sense of his situation. Who are these people? Why were they hunting him? He had heard stories of isolated tribes deep in the jungles of the mainland, but this was different. There was something sinister about these men, something that went beyond mere territorial behavior. Lost in thought, Tebello almost missed the signs of human habitation. He froze as he realized he was on the outskirts of a village. Crude huts made of branches and leaves formed a rough circle around a central clearing. Smoke rose from a large fire pit in the center. Tebello's blood ran cold as he saw what was hanging over the fire. It looked like a human leg. Suddenly, the strange bones worn by the warriors took on a horrifying new meaning. These weren't just isolated tribesmen. They were cannibals. Fighting the urge to run, Tebello forced himself to stay still and observe. He counted at least a dozen huts, which meant there could be many more of these people than he had initially thought. Women moved about the village, preparing food and tending to children. Warriors stood guard at the edges of the clearing. As Tebello watched, a group of men returned from the forest, dragging something behind them. With horror, he realized it was a body of another unfortunate soul who had washed up on their shores, perhaps. The villagers gathered around, shouting excitedly. Tebello couldn't bear to watch what happened next. He retreated deeper into the forest, his mind reeling. He was stranded on an island of cannibals, being hunted like an animal. How could he possibly survive this nightmare? As the day wore on, Tebello pushed himself to keep moving. He found more of the fruit he had eaten the night before, which helped keep his strength up. But he knew he needed more than fruit to survive. He needed a plan. That night, huddled in the branches of another tree, Tebello tried to think logically. He needed to find a way off the island, but he had no idea how big it was, or if there were any other settlements. Building a raft seemed impossible without tools and with the constant threat of discovery. As he pondered his options, a new sound reached his ears. It was faint, but unmistakable, the low drone of an airplane engine. Tebello's heart leaped. There was a chance of rescue after all. But how could he signal a plane from the dense jungle? With renewed determination, Tebello decided he needed to reach higher ground. If he could get to the mountains he had seen earlier, he might have a better chance of being spotted. It was risky. The higher areas of the island might be home to even more cannibals, but it was the only plan he had. As Tebello drifted off to sleep, he made a silent vow. He would survive this. He would find a way home, and he would never, ever take his simple life as a fisherman for granted again. As dawn broke, Tebello began his trek towards the mountains. He moved carefully, always on the lookout for signs of the cannibals. Every snapping twig made him jump. Every distant voice sent him diving for cover. The forest grew denser as he climbed. Strange birds called out overhead, their cries unlike anything Tebello had heard before. Colorful insects buzzed around him, some as big as his hand. Once, he froze in terror as a massive snake slithered across his path, its scales gleaming in a shaft of sunlight. By midday, Tebello's legs ached from the constant uphill climb. He paused to rest, leaning against a tree trunk. As he caught his breath, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices, and they were getting closer. Frantically, Tebello looked around for a hiding place. A fallen tree lay nearby, its roots creating a small cavity. Without hesitation, he squeezed himself into the tight space, pulling vines and leaves over the opening. Moments later, two of the cannibal warriors passed by. Tebello could see their feet through gaps in his leafy cover. They were talking animatedly, occasionally stopping to examine the ground. Tebello realized with horror that they were following his trail. One of the men stopped right in front of Tebello's hiding place. He knelt down, examining something on the ground. Tebello held his breath, certain that at any moment he would be discovered. The warrior called out to his companion, pointing at the ground. Just when Tebello thought his heart would burst from fear, a loud bird call echoed through the forest. Both men looked up, momentarily distracted. Then, to Tebello's immense relief, they moved on, following what they thought was his trail. Tebello waited until he could no longer hear them before crawling out of his hiding place. He knew he had to be more careful. These hunters were skilled, and he was leaving too obvious a trail. Remembering tricks his father had taught him, Tebello began to move more strategically. He walked on rocks where he could, avoiding soft earth that would show his footprints. He used branches to swing from tree to tree when possible, leaving no trail on the ground. As the day wore on, the terrain became steeper and more challenging. Tebello's progress slowed, but he pushed on, driven by the need to reach higher ground. The air grew cooler, and the vegetation changed. The thick jungle gave way to sparser, hardier plants clinging to rocky slopes. Just as the sun was setting, Tebello emerged from the tree line onto a rocky outcrop. The view took his breath away. He could see much of the island spread out below him, a sea of green treetops stretching to the distant beaches. On the horizon, the ocean glimmered orange in the fading light. But what caught Tebello's attention was a column of smoke rising from a valley to his left. It had to be another village. His heart sank as he realized just how many of these cannibals might be living on the island. As darkness fell, Tebello found a small cave in the rocks. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safer than sleeping in the trees. He gathered some leaves for a bed and settled in for the night, his mind racing with plans and fears. The next morning, Tebello continued his ascent. The going was tough, with sheer rock faces and treacherous scree slopes. More than once, he nearly lost his footing, saved only by his quick reflexes. By midday, he had climbed high enough to see most of the island. It was larger than he had thought, with several valleys nestled between rocky peaks. He could see smoke rising from at least 3 different locations, confirming his fears about the number of cannibal villages. As Tebello surveyed the island, movement in the valley below caught his eye. A large group of warriors was on the move, clearly on a hunting expedition. With a jolt of fear, he realized they were heading in his direction. Tebello knew he couldn't outrun them on this rocky terrain. He needed to hide, and fast. Scanning the area, he spotted a narrow crevice in a nearby rock face. It was his only option. Squeezing into the tight space, Tebello inched his way deeper into the mountain. The passage was dark and claustrophobic, barely wide enough for him to pass. Just as he thought it might close up entirely, the crevice opened into a small cavern. Tebello found himself in a space about the size of his family's hut back home. A small hole in the ceiling let in a shaft of light, illuminating the cave. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he gasped in amazement. The walls of the cave were covered in paintings. Ancient images of people, animals, and strange symbols covered every surface. Some seemed to depict hunts or battles, while others showed rituals around a central figure wearing an elaborate headdress. But what really caught Tebello's attention was a series of paintings near the back of the cave. They seemed to tell a story: a group of people arriving on the island in boats, a great conflict, and then the victors engaging in a terrible feast. The final image showed the victorious tribe wearing bone necklaces, standing over the bodies of their enemies. With a chill, Tebello realized he was looking at the origin story of the cannibals. This wasn't just an isolated tribe. Their brutal practices were part of a long, dark history. As fascinating as the discovery was, Tebello knew he couldn't stay in the cave forever. He needed to find a way off the island before he ended up like the victims in the paintings. With great caution, he made his way back to the crevice and peered out. The hunting party had passed by, oblivious to his hiding place. But as Tebello scanned the area, he noticed a thin trail of smoke rising from the valley below. Curiosity battled with fear in his mind. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to investigate. hoping to gain some insight that might help him escape. Moving silently through the underbrush, Tebello made his way down the slope. As he got closer to the source of the smoke, he could hear voices, guttural shouts, and what sounded like celebratory cries. The foliage thinned, revealing a small clearing. Tebello's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. A group of about 20 cannibals had gathered in the clearing. In the center, a large fire pit smoldered, tendrils of smoke rising into the air. But it was what hung above the fire that made Tebello's stomach churn, the body of a man, suspended from a crude wooden frame. Tebello watched in horror as two warriors approached the body with long, sharp knives. With practiced movements, they began to butcher the corpse, cutting away large chunks of flesh and tossing them to others who waited eagerly nearby. The sickening sound of blade on bone echoed through the clearing. Unable to look away, Tebello observed as the cannibals prepared their grisly feast. Some of the meat was skewered on sticks and held over the fire, the fat sizzling and dripping into the flames. Other pieces were tossed into large clay pots that bubbled ominously over smaller fires. The smell that wafted up to Tebello's hiding place was disturbingly enticing, like roasting pork, but with an underlying scent that spoke of something forbidden. He felt bile rise in his throat and had to fight the urge to retch, knowing that any sound could give away his position. As the cooking continued, Tebello noticed a hierarchical structure among the cannibals. The largest and most elaborately decorated warrior, clearly the chief, was given the choicest cuts. He sat on a throne-like chair made of bones, watching the proceedings with a mixture of satisfaction and boredom, as if this were a common occurrence. Younger members of the tribe scurried about, tending the fires and preparing what looked like a mixture of herbs and roots. Tebello realized they were creating some sort of marinade or sauce for the human meat. The casual way they went about this task sent shivers down his spine for them. This was normal, everyday behavior. A commotion at the edge of the clearing drew Tebello's attention. Two warriors dragged in a struggling figure, a young man, not much older than Tebello himself. With a jolt, Tebello recognized him as one of the fishermen from a neighboring village. The man's terrified eyes darted around the clearing, taking in the horrific scene. The chief rose from his bone throne, approaching the captive with slow, deliberate steps. He spoke in a language Tebello couldn't understand, but the menacing tone needed no translation. The young fisherman began to sob, pleading for his life in a language similar to Tebello's own. With a gesture from the chief, the captive was tied to a post near the fire. Tebello realized with growing horror that they intended to keep him alive, presumably to ensure the meat would be fresh for their next meal. The thought made him feel dizzy with revulsion and fear. As night began to fall, the feasting commenced. Tebello watched as the cannibals tore into the cooked human flesh with savage glee. They smeared the herb mixture on the meat, laughing and talking as if this were a normal dinner. Some gnawed on bones, cracking them open to suck out the marrow. The chief presided over the macabre banquet, occasionally tossing scraps to what Tebello now recognized as human-dog hybrids, monstrous creatures that lurked at the edges of the firelight, their eyes gleaming with feral hunger. These beasts, Tebello realized, must be how the cannibals tracked their prey so effectively. As the night wore on, the cannibals began a series of ritualistic dances around the fire. They chanted in their guttural language, their bodies painted with symbols that glowed eerily in the firelight. Some wore necklaces of human teeth, which clacked together as they moved. Tebello noticed that a few of the younger tribe members were being given their first tastes of human flesh. It seemed to be a rite of passage, with the older warriors watching approvingly as the youngsters consumed the forbidden meat. The look of initial disgust on the young faces quickly gave way to a disturbing enthusiasm. Throughout the night, Tebello remained frozen in his hiding place, unable to move for fear of discovery, yet unable to look away from the nightmarish scene. He found himself wondering about the origins of this tribe. Had they always been cannibals, Or had some terrible circumstance in their past driven them to this? The cave paintings flashed in his mind, hinting at a long and dark history. As dawn approached, the cannibals finally began to disperse, many of them stumbling from the effects of some fermented drink they had consumed with their grisly meal. Tebello watched as they casually tossed leftover human bones to the hybrid dogs, who fought over the remnants. The young fisherman, still tied to the post, had long since fallen into a state of shock, his eyes vacant and staring. Tebello felt a pang of guilt for not being able to help him. But he knew that any attempt at rescue would only result in his own capture. As the last of the cannibals disappeared into the jungle, Tebello finally allowed himself to move. His muscles screamed in protest after hours of stillness. Slowly, carefully, he made his way back up the mountain, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed. The experience had shaken Tebello to his core, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He had to find a way off this island, not just for his own sake, but to warn others of the danger that lurked here. As he climbed, he began to formulate a plan, one that would require all of his courage and cunning to execute. He spent the whole day planning his escape to ensure there are no mistakes. As night fell, Tebello huddled in the cave, trying to work out his first move. He was safer up here in the mountains, but he was no closer to rescue. He needed to find a way to signal for help without alerting the cannibals to his location. As he pondered his options, a new sound reached his ears. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind. But as Tebello strained to listen, his heart leaped with hope. It was the distant throb of a boat engine. Somewhere out there, beyond the shores of this nightmare island, was a boat. And where there was a boat, there was hope of rescue. But how could he reach it without being caught by the cannibals? As Tebello drifted off into an uneasy sleep, his dreams were filled with images of the cave paintings, boats on a stormy sea, and the ever-present threat of the cannibal hunters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. Somehow, he had to find a way to survive and escape this island of horrors. Tebello woke before dawn, the sound of the boat engine still echoing in his mind. He knew he had to act fast if he wanted any chance of rescue. Carefully, he emerged from the cave and climbed to a high point where he could see the ocean. In the dim pre-dawn light, he spotted a small fishing boat, similar to the ones from his village, moving slowly along the coast. It was far away, but it was real. Tebello's heart raced with excitement and fear. This could be his only chance. He needed to signal the boat without alerting the cannibals. Fire was too risky, the smoke would be seen for miles. Then he remembered something his grandfather had once taught him about reflecting sunlight to communicate over long distances. Tebello searched the area frantically, looking for anything shiny. His eyes fell on a piece of quartz embedded in a nearby rock. With trembling hands, he pried it loose and cleaned it on his tattered shirt. As the sun began to rise, Tebello positioned himself carefully. He angled the quartz, trying to catch the sunlight and reflect it towards the boat. His arms ached from holding the position, but he didn't dare stop. This was his lifeline. Minutes passed like hours. The boat continued its slow journey, showing no signs of noticing his signal. Tebello's hope began to fade. Then, suddenly, the boat changed course. It was heading towards the island. Tebello's elation was short-lived. A commotion in the valley below caught his attention. The cannibals had spotted the boat too. Warriors were rushing to the beach, weapons in hand. Others were heading up the mountain straight towards Tebello. In that moment, Tebello knew he had to make a choice. Stay hidden and safe, or risk everything for a chance at rescue. With a deep breath, he made his decision. Moving as fast as he dared on the treacherous slope, Tebello began to make his way down the mountain. He could hear shouts behind him. The warriors had spotted him. His legs burned with effort as he half ran, half slid down the rocky terrain. A spear whistled past his ear, embedding itself in a tree trunk. Tebello didn't look back. He could hear the warriors gaining on him, their war cries echoing off the rocks. The beach seemed impossibly far away. As he burst out of the tree line onto the sand, Tebello saw the boat. It was closer now, but the cannibals were swarming the beach. He was trapped between the warriors behind him and those on the shore. In desperation, Tebello charged into the surf. He dove under a wave just as another spear sliced through the water where he had been. Swimming with all his might, he headed for the boat. The salt water stung his eyes, and his lungs burned for air. He could hear splashing behind him the warriors were giving chase. Just when he thought he couldn't go on, a strong hand grabbed his arm and hauled him out of the water. Tebello found himself on the deck of the fishing boat, gasping for air. A weathered old man was shouting orders in a language Tebello didn't understand. The boat's engine roared to life, and they began to pull away from the shore. The cannibals howled in fury, some still swimming after the boat, others throwing spears that fell harmlessly into the water. As the island receded into the distance, Tebello finally allowed himself to believe that he had escaped. The old fisherman helped Tebello to a sitting position and offered him water. Though they couldn't understand each other's words, the kindness in the man's eyes spoke volumes. Tebello was safe. As the boat chugged towards the mainland, Tebello's mind whirled with all that had happened. The storm, the island, the cannibals, the cave paintings, it all seemed like a terrible dream. But the aches in his body and the tattered state of his clothes were vivid reminders that it had all been terrifyingly real. Hours later, as the sun was setting, Tebello caught sight of a familiar coastline. Tears welled up in his eyes as he recognized his home village. The old fisherman seemed to understand and patted Tebello's shoulder gently. As they approached the shore, Tebello saw a crowd gathering. Word of his return had spread quickly. He could make out his parents' faces, etched with worry and joy. His friends and fellow fishermen cheered as the boat docked. Tebello's feet had barely touched the sand before he was engulfed in his mother's embrace. His father, a man not given to displays of emotion, wept openly as he hugged his son. The whole village celebrated the return of the boy they had thought lost at sea. That night, as Tebello sat surrounded by his family and friends, he began to tell his story. He spoke of the storm and his days adrift. He described the island and its fearsome inhabitants. He told them about his narrow escapes, the cave paintings, and his daring rescue. The villagers listened in stunned silence, scarcely believing the horrors Tebello had endured. The elders nodded gravely, saying they had heard stories of islands where dark practices still held sway. Tebello's tale would be retold for generations, a warning of the dangers that lurked in unknown waters. As the night wore on and the excitement began to die down, Tebello found a moment of quiet. He stood at the water's edge, looking out at the sea that had nearly claimed his life. The same sea that had been his livelihood for as long as he could remember. Tebello knew that his life would never be the same. The horrors he had witnessed and the challenges he had overcome had changed him forever. But as he stood there, feeling the familiar sand beneath his feet and smelling the salt air, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He was home. He was safe. And he had a new appreciation for the simple life he had once taken for granted. Tebello knew that one day he would return to fishing these waters. But for now, he was content to be on solid ground, surrounded by the people he loved. As he turned to walk back to the village, Tebello made a silent vow. He would live his life to the fullest, cherishing every moment with his family and friends. And he would never forget the lessons learned on that island of terror, the strength he found within himself, and the preciousness of life and freedom. The nightmare was over. A new day was dawning, full of hope and possibility. And Tebello was ready to embrace it with open arms.